They're magically delicious. Okay, 1 minute in, my heart rate is 128. Time to talk about the cardiovascular system. We're starting from the perspective that the major function of the cardiovascular system is to maintain homeostasis of the interstitial fluid. In order to do this, blood flow has to be sufficient to deliver the nutrients that are consumed by the cell and remove any waste products. So if metabolic activity increases in a tissue, blood flow has to increase to resupply that tissue. In order to look at how the cardiovascular system adapts to meet metabolic demands, we're going to look at a specific situation. We're going to look at how our bodies adapt as we go from rest to exercise. And rather than doing this in some abstract form, I thought I'd give a demonstration. And I'm going to eat a bowl of Lucky Charms, wait 30 minutes, and then start to exercise. The demonstration involves adaptation of a lot of different systems, so I included metrics like blood lactate, blood sugar, and respirations. But this video focuses on the cardiovascular system, so I'm going to ask that we focus only on heart rate and blood pressure, and we'll get to some of the other metrics in different videos. You probably imagine that we're going to use all of the core concepts in anatomy and physiology as we talk about the cardiovascular system, and that's true. I've already mentioned homeostasis. We need to maintain homeostasis of the interstitial fluid. An emphasis in the cardiovascular system is going to be on blood pressure. And blood pressure is a force that pushes blood through our system. More pressure, more blood flow. So when we look at changes in blood flow, we need to consider changes in pressure. The other component is resistance in vessels. Greater resistance is going to slow blood flow. So we need to look at the relationship between pressure and flow in the cardiovascular system. The third core concept, the relationship between structure and function, is going to apply to vessels and the heart, but I already mentioned one component about regulating resistance of blood vessels. How does that happen? We regulate the diameter. So a smaller diameter blood vessel has greater resistance and is going to reduce blood flow, whereas as vessels dilate and become bigger, resistance decreases and flow increases. So let's get started. First, let me show you the setup. I'm using an automated blood pressure cuff. I prefer to use a human. You'll see that I missed a lot of measurements during exercise because there's a lot of noise and a human can filter that out. I measured heart rate continuously by wearing a heart rate strap and having it recorded on a cycling computer that just records it as a data file. So the trainer itself I set to hold a fixed power output. So my intensity, exercise intensity, remained constant the entire time. And what we're looking at is variations in heart rate and variations in blood pressure for those measurements that I got it. Now I haven't shown it here, but this is 30 minutes after I've eaten a bowl of Lucky Charms. And ideally it would have been more like an hour to really send my body into the absorptive state, where my body is storing energy. And then we're rapidly going to go to an exercising state with no warm-up. This is intentional so that we can look at how homeostasis is disturbed and then reestablished. Okay, 1 minute in, my heart rate is 128. First, let's look at the heart rate response. I'll call your attention initially to the intensity at which I'm exercising. So I start at about 240 watts. There's a 10 watt bump 3 minutes in, but effectively the intensity is constant. So the energy expenditure throughout this session is about the same, at least on a bike. As I overheat, I have to spend some energy scrubbing that heat, but effectively the intensity on the bike is the same. Since that's the case, we can just get rid of that power line and look at the heart rate response on its own. This line, this mark, is about the 10-minute mark. And if we go up, the heart rate starts in the neighborhood of 80 beats per minute. I had some anticipation of beginning exercise. And there's a rapid increase followed by a stabilization. And this stabilization occurs at, for me at this intensity, somewhere between 153 and 158 beats per minute. So since I know that I was exercising at the same intensity over the first 3 to 5 minutes and the first 10 minutes as I was the rest of the time, the question is, what's going on during this time period that it takes for my heart rate to stabilize and blood flow to exercising muscles to remain consistent where it needs to be. In order to answer these questions, in order to figure out what's going on here, we have to look at the correct order of events. The first event to happen is in the muscle cells. The muscles start to contract and use ATP. That's immediate. We couldn't produce the power if the cells weren't using ATP. The drop in ATP levels within the cells causes changes in the interstitial fluid. And as the interstitial fluid changes, so does the blood composition and blood vessel diameter. So first we have changes in the cell, and then those changes start to affect the blood and the rest of the body. At that point, there are a series of negative feedback loops that kick in so that our body can adapt. And that takes time. There are immediate changes in the muscle. Those changes affect the blood, and then our bodies adapt. It's not that our sympathetic nervous system or increased heart rate causes increased muscle contraction, but the other way around. Now let's look at a blood pressure response. My resting blood pressure was 121/75. Maybe a little nervous being on YouTube here. 121 is called a systolic blood pressure. It's 121 millimeters of mercury, and that's the pressure in my arteries when the heart is contracting. 75 millimeters of mercury, the lower number, that's the pressure in my arteries when the heart is relaxed between beats. Now, because my heart is contracting for a shorter time than it's at rest, we calculate a mean arterial pressure, which is closer to the diastolic pressure. We'll get into those details in another video. But the mean arterial pressure at rest was about 90 millimeters of mercury. Now, after I'd been exercising for about 5 minutes, my blood pressure climbed to 185 systolic over 80 diastolic. So, and the mean arterial pressure here is about 115 millimeters of mercury. So it might not be surprising that blood pressure climbs, and that's going to provide a greater force for blood to flow throughout the body. What might be surprising is that diastolic blood pressure doesn't change much. So this graph shows systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and mean arterial pressure. Let me just connect those dots. Okay, so systolic blood pressure climbs quite a bit and then starts to decline. These numbers are recovery and resting numbers, so we won't worry about that too much for now. But what I will call your attention to is diastolic blood pressure. Here on the bottom, really doesn't change much. The diastolic blood pressure stays steady while the systolic blood pressure climbs, and the end result, when you look at mean arterial blood pressure here in the middle, that yes, there's an increase in blood pressure, but that's due almost entirely to changes in systolic blood pressure. For our discussion later, I realize I need to give you some axis titles here. Sorry about that. Notice that this elevated blood pressure really comes at 5 minutes into the exercise. And remember that heart rate stabilized about 10 minutes in. So there was initial rapid climb in blood pressure that seemed to drop a little as we stabilized. However, diastolic pressure did not change. Okay, so we can summarize what we know from this demonstration, starting with the fact that we have no measurement of blood flow, either to muscles or the kidney and digestive system. And that's what matters. If we want to maintain the composition of the interstitial fluid and match blood flow to metabolic activity, then we need to know the blood flow. But we do have some hints about what's going on, and we'll be able to fill in some gaps. We know that there are changes in the muscle that occur before changes in heart rate and blood pressure. We saw that. We saw the power output increase way before we saw changes in blood pressure and heart rate or cardiac output. Okay, but we know that there are some feedback loops that exist to help us restore homeostasis. The reason we know that is because that is a sustainable exercise intensity. So if I weren't able to restore homeostasis, then I wouldn't be able to sustain that intensity. The long and the short of it is we need to start at the muscle. And that's going to tell us how changes in the local vessels, the vessels that feed the muscle, start to change the rest of the body, so that then these broader changes occur that will affect blood flow to the abdominal cavity, kidneys, and the digestive system, as well as non-exercising muscles in the arms.